Hello. So far in this class we've been discussing the perceived conflict between the Bible and science. My position has been that that conflict is somewhat artificial, maintained by those who profit from the conflict, but that actually a responsible interpretation of the Bible sees that the conflict really doesn't need to occur. Now what do I mean by that? Well, the major conflict that's historically occurred between the Bible interpretation and science, there's been a number of them, but the one that's been the nexus of the most conflict has been in the creation stories of Genesis. Genesis 1 through 11 specifically in a large sense, but oftentimes that gets narrowed down to Genesis 1, 2, and 3 in the creation stories of the early part. And I say stories specifically in the plural, specifically because there are two creation stories in the early Genesis that cannot be reconciled together. Genesis 1 is a macro creation of when God creates all the categories of creation, separating them in a literary sense into a series of days. So they're creating the greater and the lesser lights, and then creating the stars, creating the earth, creating the beasts. All these are separated in a literary sense into days, but in reality they are categories of creation. And I also uploaded an article by Johnston, Dr. Johnston, about the Egyptian parallels in the Genesis accounts. So, and Babylonian ways in which those creation stories have similarities demonstrate that it's unlikely, in my view, and also according to Mitchell's book, it's unlikely that the original authors are intended to offer a science set of science assertions, but instead using story to explain why the world works the way it does in that day, according to life in God's world. But that conflict has been perpetuated, the conflict between the Bible and science has been perpetuated by ways in which the Genesis accounts are interpreted. Now this is the point where we have to keep in mind that hermeneutics, I'm introducing a term here, hermeneutics. I forget that for many students who have taken my class on the Bible and Western science in class have heard this idea before. For some of you, you may not have taken that class before, and I keep forgetting that that's not always the case. There isn't that much overlap. So I may need to reiterate it here. Hermeneutics is the science and art of interpretation. It's the process whereby you seek to account for the literary, historical, cultural, linguistic background or context in which this original story is found. You may have a document in front of you, and so by means of translation you can answer the question, what does it say? But hermeneutics answers the question, what does it mean? Translation answers the question, what does it say? But hermeneutics answers the question, what does it mean? Because hermeneutics is the science and art of interpretation of any document. It is the way in which you look into what's written to say, what is the author intending to convey? And remember, with any speech or any message, there's always three components to consider. One, the assumptions of the author. Two, the assumptions of the audience. And three, the exchange that's expected to occur between them. So, what are the assumptions of the author, the original author of Genesis? What are the assumptions of the original audience? Say, according to within the story of the Bible, that would be early Hebrews fresh out of slavery in Egypt. So the original author of the Bible asserts, now I don't want to get into various different possible authors for Genesis at this time, but just within its own internal integrity, the Bible asserts that Moses writes Genesis. It attributes the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, to Moses, to at least writing or at least compiling those stories into a completed literary form. Well, if just taking the Bible stories at face value, and you don't have to, but many Christians do, just taking those stories at face value, if Moses writes Genesis, then Moses is not present at the time that creation occurs. So therefore, he is possibly receiving that oral tradition, oral history, to compile it into one, or He is is also writing a creation story and possibly using that creation story in ways that other ancient Near Eastern kingdoms use their creation stories to show why their culture is the center of the world, center of the universe. But nevertheless, if we go ahead and, as many Christians think that if they accept the Bible at face value, that Moses wrote Genesis. If that's the case, then hermeneutics has to account for what possibly might have been Moses' assumptions. What does he understand such that he would write Genesis the way he does? Then we would have to account for who's his original audience. Well, if Moses is the original audience, if Moses is the original author, then his original audience would have to be the first people he would write something to. Within the story of the Bible, those would be the early Hebrews fresh out of Egypt. So, hermeneutics says, let's assume Moses is the author. Many scholars disagree, but many Christians think he did. So let's at least go with that. We have to account for the assumptions that Moses has, and we have to account for the assumptions of the early Hebrews fresh out of Egypt, and what needs to be conveyed between them. In light of all those various different factors, I agree, and so does Lynn Mitchell, with various scholars that see Moses as intending something very different with the creation stories of Genesis than what many have twisted it into to create the conflict between the Bible and science today. A conflict which began in the 19th century when early consumers of the theories of evolution saw a supposed conflict with Christianity that they then blew up into something much larger than it needed to be. You've watched creation, you've watched videos about the monkey trial. You're having to wrestle with the idea of, is the Bible and science really in conflict? And I've been making the assertion that it's not, because the Bible is asserting spiritual truths, not trying to write science text. And that the attempts to make it a science text have been a misuse of the Bible, actually interpreting it poorly. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, if you engage in bad hermeneutics, if you engage in poor interpretive methods in order to perpetuate a conflict between the science and the Bible, then you do a couple things. One, you not only maintain an artificial conflict that need not be, but also you fail to interpret this sacred text, this holy document, according to the the Christian religion. Christian and Hebrew religion, but mostly American Christianity does this. You not only perpetuate an artificial conflict between science and the Bible, but you fail to interpret it for its actual message that people should be taking to heart and applying to themselves. So it's not just that you maintain an artificial conflict and you keep this fight going between evolution and science and Bible-believing people of faith everywhere, a conflict which doesn't even need to occur. It's that you also fail to interpret it for its real message that people should be, if a person's within a religious context, many Christians believe the Bible, you also fail to take into account what its real message is so that it can be applied successfully. So, my passion is that people would engage in responsible hermeneutics. In the class on science and Bible and Western culture, we talk about hermeneutics and we talk about what is necessary in order to interpret it faithfully. Well, there's a number of different avenues you can go with this. Many are familiar with the literalist interpretation, that just simply reads it in its English form and decides that all of it must be fact, without ever accounting for literary genre, different figures of speech, simile, hyperbole, metaphor, any of those type of literary type of devices that are found throughout the Bible. See, the Bible is a very diverse book. It has, in the Protestant tradition, it has 66 books. If you're only counting the Protestant canon, there are more that are added to that for the Roman Catholic tradition. But 66 books in the Protestant Christian tradition. Now that's accounting the Old and New Testaments, 39 books of the Old Testament and the 27 for the New Testament. But let's just go safe with just Hebrew Bible, which is the 39 books of the Old Testament. There's still incredible literary diversity. as each one of those books makes its own unique contribution to the overall collection. And so therefore, one of the most mindless things I ever hear that someone tells me is they say, well, if the Genesis isn't exact factual reporting, then how can you believe any of the Bible? To that, I wanted to ask them, have you read any of the Bible? Are you familiar with its contents? Because you don't sound like you do. Are you aware of its rich diversity? The various different authors, the various different literary genres and styles, the types of literary devices that are used to convey the message over a course of 1,000 years the Old Testament was written. According to its own internal reporting, Moses would exist sometime around 1500 BC up until the point of Malachi, which would be closer to about 400 BC. So over that course of time, Israelite society had gone through a significant cultural evolution. There's a great deal of outside literary influences that come in, and they cross-pollinate with their ancient Near Eastern neighbors, and that is evident within the writing itself. In some of the prophets, you see literary style such as Nahum. You see literary style which is similar to that of Assyria. So because it's an oracle that's designed against Syria. You see literary style within Daniel that suggests of Babylonian influence. You see aspects of Proverbs where Egyptian wisdom literature has been grafted directly into the Proverbs in order to show that wisdom comes from all around the world. There are a variety of ways in which the Bible can be examined in order to account for its various different literary devices, its different conventions, and that diversity needs to be accounted for. And so it's really ridiculous to say, well, if Genesis isn't straight factual reporting, how do you believe any of it? Well, because of its diversity. And I can believe, as a Christian even, I can believe that every part of the Bible, if I'm a Christian, and say if a person's devout, if they are very religious and very desirous to revere the Word of God and to see all of it as true, then it still behooves them to examine every part of it to see what conventions are used by the author, human and divine, because people still want to consider the Bible a divine book too. Okay, fine. We'll say that. In a Christian context, they refer to it as God's Word or a divine book. But you still have to account for the human agency utilized by God in the writing of the Bible. It's not dictation. The Bible was not let down out of the heavens and simply plopped into someone's lap. Human agency was used to write this document, and you have to account for it. And so if I really revere it, if I'm a Christian, and if I'm a person of great faith, and I really do want to imbibe what the Bible has to say, imbibe its messages, and apply it really well, it really behooves me to do the work, to engage in responsible interpretation, to account for the message meant to be conveyed. And over time, my contention has been that the conflict between the Bible and science is perpetuated by those with their own agenda, an agenda that to them is more important than actually discovering what it is likely that Moses meant to say to that original Hebrew audience fresh out of Egypt, and how that communication would take place between them. That's my 2 cents that I wanted to offer to the discussion about Bible interpretation. As a result, the conflict is really more of an artificial one. And we'll talk a little bit more about who perpetuates this conflict and why do they benefit from it. All right? There's some food for thought.